This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
Let me tell you guys about a sponsor of this show, and that is Zippix toothpicks. They are wonderful, flavored toothpicks that have nicotine in each one. You can find them at zippixtoothpicks.com. A lot of you are probably trying to kick a bad habit here in the new year. These are a great alternative to that habit. And come on, let's face it. They're sponsoring this show, so you know that's a good thing. But I'm telling you, they're the cheapest alternative on the market. They've got flavors. Let me tell you, right here, I've got my packet. Zippix toothpicks, spearmint spice. I love this flavor. They've got whiskey flavor. They've got clove flavor. They want to sponsor shows like mine, so that should make you want to give them some business. They've got a promo code, a new one with the Counterflow podcast. The promo code is BUCK, B-U-C-K, of course. So go to Zippix Toothpicks. That promo code, BUCK, will get you 10% off of your order. Once again, zippixtoothpicks.com, promo code BUCK for 10% off your order. They're delicious. They got just the right amount of nicotine in them, and you will enjoy them. Kick that nasty habit, and let's get to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again. Yeah, the Counterflow podcast, back at it. My guest today, he's someone I consider one of the most important voices in what let's loosely call it the liberty world. And he's the president of what I would consider the most important organization in existence, and that would be the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. If you're unfamiliar with the Institute, which by now you should not be, but you never know. I get a lot of new listeners. They exist to promote teaching and research in the Austrian School of Economics and individual freedom, honest history, which we don't have near enough of, and international peace, same thing. It's in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises and, of course, the great Murray Rothbard. I can say this, if you have a chance to attend an event put on by the Mises Institute, I highly, highly recommend it. What wonderful people you will meet. I've met many people doing just that, going to their events, and we've become friends. And so it's super, super nice. It's a wonderful community. And so, like I said, I highly recommend it. They put on events all over the country. And one of my goals, in fact, in 2021 is to actually go to the Institute and see it in person. I will do that at some point, and hopefully sooner rather than later. They separate themselves there, the Mises Institute, I would say, from other, let's say, would-be similar institutions in that they are away from the beltway and the filth of Washington, D.C. politics, and they're truly unafraid to be non-political, non-partisan, and non-PC, and I love that about him. And Jeff Deist represents them quite well because he's, if anything, truly unafraid to speak his mind. And I think you know that if you know who he is already. And if not, you will find that out in this discussion. In this chat, we're going to talk about several things. One being the Paleo-libertarian alliance, which is not just one of my favorite things to discuss. You guys seem to love it as well. I got a lot of excitement out there when I mentioned that this would be a possible topic. And so I know there's plenty of people stoked to hear about it. We also discuss what the hell to do right now. Obviously, we are in some strange and wild times, and so we kind of look to the brilliant people in our movement and ask, what's going on? What do you see? What do you make of all of this? So we're going to get into that. We discuss the old right, also known as maybe the original anti-war right wing in this country, and I think you'll enjoy that discussion. Is that on its way back? Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Of course, we get into secession as well. It's one of Jeff's favorite topics and mine, of course. You guys know that. So let's get to it. Like I said, he's one of my most popular guests to get on this show. I'm pleased to welcome the president of the Mises Institute, Mr. Jeff Deist. Jeff, good to have you back on. How are you, sir?
I am doing great, Buck. Thanks so much.
Yeah, well, it feels like there's some kind of saying like nothing happens for a decade and then a decade happens in a week or something. And it feels like we're moving at a rapid pace right now. So there's all kinds of stuff I could ask you. There's some themes I want to hit upon, and we can get maybe into some current events towards the end. Does it feel to you like there's this strong undercurrent bubbling up kind of just below the surface, and it maybe won't take much for things to get out of hand at any moment? Do you feel that tension at all?
I'm not sure. It's hard to say because I have my own filters. I live in my own bubble of social media and content and the kind of traditional media I consume, my particular town, my particular family. So we all are subject to seeing the world through a particular lens, which may not reflect the broader reality. So it's very, very difficult for me to say how much anger or unrest is out there. It's obviously an uncomfortable and unpleasant time in the United States. So you get the sense that the whole country would sort of like to cry uncle and say, okay, we'll give anything if you just let us have sort of a gathering period or a time where everything isn't so politicized, a stasis of some kind. And you wonder if that isn't actually a very effective tool of progressives, because if they can create this sort of constant upset, this constant revolutionary air where nobody's ever settled, then I think people become a lot more malleable because they're so desirous of getting back to normal or some kind of normal or even a new normal, but just not having these day-to-day upheavals. And so it's, between COVID and the Trump stuff, it's been unsettling, certainly, to see how docile a lot of Americans are with respect to lockdowns in the physical world or shutdowns and deplatforming in the digital world.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It feels like there was such a push towards this unrest that you're discussing that I heard people that I know would otherwise never consider a vote for someone like Joe Biden say, you almost wonder if we just get him in office, we can feel normal again, or this stuff will just stop. And so if that is a strategy by the left, then I have to say, unfortunately, like most of their strategies, it's quite effective. I think I have learned this. I mean, I've always thought this, but recently it's really hit that I think it's important to constantly evaluate where we are, what's changed, where it looks like we're headed. And I think one of the biggest problems that I have with what I call the blue-pilled libertarians is that a lot of them seem to kind of live in 2012 and operate at that level. And I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the current state of libertarianism, and we can call it Libertarian Inc.? How have they adapted to the current political climate in your mind?
What do you mean by living in 2012, I guess would be my first question.
Because I see a lot of the Democrats and Republicans are all the same from that crowd. And I think that the Trump moment proved, at least in my mind, that they're not the same. And I actually think a lot of the MAGA types are probably more ready for Ron Paul's 2008 message than they were back then. But a lot of the LP types are still kind of living in 2008, 2012, like Gary Johnson's the answer, and Republican and Democrats, they're all the same. And like we've learned nothing over the last 4 years.
Okay, I see what you mean. It's, again, hard to say because I don't really travel in Libertarian Inc. circles. As a matter of fact, I work very hard not to. I consider libertarianism basically in big trouble today, at least in my conception of it, which would be a sort of a Ron Paul Rothbardian conception of it. And so from where I stand, I suspect most libertarians voted for Biden, if they voted. I mean, nobody voted for the lady, who was the LP candidate?
Jo Jorgensen.
Yeah, she didn't get a lot of votes. To my recollection, she didn't get as many as Gary Johnson. Is that correct?
Right. That's correct.
Okay, so I think they all voted for Biden. And why wouldn't they? I mean, when you say that you have the same progressive ends but just want to use different means, then why wouldn't you just vote for Joe Biden? That's fine if you want to vote for Biden. I don't care. I don't go around trying to say you're not a true libertarian, you're not this, that, because more and more I guess I see myself more as old right. I mean, I'm libertarian in the anti-state sense, in the sense that I believe in and advocate political liberty. And I think everyone should. And political liberty is the best approach to hammering out all these divisions in society and having the best economy and having the best standard of living and having the best approach to technology and the best approach to, all the wonderment, that capitalism and markets bring us. So I definitely believe in political liberty. I'm not so sure anymore that libertarianism is really headed in that direction.
Yeah, and you mentioned something. I want to talk about the old right, because I feel, and maybe it's the bubble I'm in, that there's kind of an undercurrent of that kind of bubbling under the surface. And a lot of people hear that term and maybe they don't understand it. I want to talk about the old right, the paleo movement, and I think it's a time we could teach some of my listeners who maybe have heard those terms but aren't quite dialed in on what they mean. Can you talk about the old right and what that means and how closely they would likely align with many people probably listening to us right now?
Well, it's basically the right in America before, from my perspective anyway, it was ruined somewhere in the mid-20th century by a lot of ex-Trotskyites who surrounded William F. Buckley and went on to be animated by National Review and also the Cold War. So people who became Cold Warriors and who were willing to accept a lot of the left welfare state as long as it was accompanied by militarism, interventionism, and anti-Soviet rhetoric. So those people later on became neoconservative, some of them, and that's not a slur. There's actually a definition of neoconservative given us by Irving Kristol. So the right sort of got off its rails at some point in the 20th century. But avatars of the old right would include Albert J. Nock. They would include the great writer from the Saturday Evening Post, Garrett Garrett. Senator Taft from Ohio would be probably the leading political figure. And so Warren Buffett's dad, Howard Buffett, was actually, I think, someone we could consider to be a member of the old right when he was in Congress. So these were people who were suspicious of military interventionism and not entirely sold on the World War I project. These are people who believed in hard money, especially gold-backed money. And these are people who generally believed, as conservatives once believed, that state power and state force ought to be used judiciously, if at all, and that there were whole swaths of human existence which ought to, be allowed to exist outside of the state. And so that all changed markedly for the worse as the 20th century progressed, and here we are. But I guess the thing about the old right, which is so appealing, is that it was not militaristic. And so it lacked all the jingoism and the interventionist impulse and, make the world safe for democracy that we find today in sort of the McCains of the world and his progeny. So if you want to read something short, let me just recommend to your listeners an essay called The Revolution Was by Garrett Garrett. Again, he was a journalist and a writer, wrote for many years for the Saturday Evening Post. He wrote this essay called The Revolution Was, meaning past tense. And he's writing this at the end of the 30s as some of the New Deal programs are beginning to become implemented and have already been passed into law. And he just makes such a great point, and you can just literally read the few opening paragraphs of this essay. It's at Mises.org. You just look up The Revolution Was. And he explains how revolutions take place right under our noses. And so by the time the effects of the revolution are becoming fully felt, it's too late. And so the New Deal represented one of these kinds of revolutions, which he terms a revolution within the form. And I think that's what's been happening for many, many years in the United States more recently, is that we still have all the familiar forms of governance around us. We have the president and the Supreme Court. We have the two branches of Congress. We have our local governments and all this and that. And it all has this sort of veneer of process and form. And at the same time, we still have all the familiar forms of media and academia and the performing arts and cultural institutions. So everything is still sort of the same in form, but in practice, in what they actually do all day, it's generally the opposite of what they're supposed to do. In other words, churches don't do what they're supposed to do. Media doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Governments do the opposite of securing peace and property rights and liberty. And so you get this sort of strange feeling. It's almost like a Stephen King movie where the scariest parts are when something very familiar, maybe a room you've been in before, a street you've walked down before, suddenly takes on a very different tone. And that's really what happens in America. We don't like politics that much, I think. We don't want to be revolutionaries. We don't want to be out in the streets. I think what we're seeing on TV is a tiny sliver of Americans. But as a result of that, the people who do want to be nothing but politics 24/7 and who do want to remake humans into something more perfect for the state, and by that I mean progressives of both left and right, for these people who never sleep, they can achieve sort of revolutionary aims without revolutionary forms. They can just sort of, still let us have the pretend version of the rule of law, a pretend version of the Constitution, a pretend version of electoral politics. And this is really, it's ingenious. And if you look at the left, for the most part, up until recently, maybe the past few years, they were quite comfortable achieving their long-term goals through managerialism, as James Burnham called it, the great trend of the 20th century. They didn't, you don't need to roll up tanks and have violent coups. You can do all kinds of things via the administrative state under everyone's nose. And so this is really remarkable, I think, if we view the 20th century and now the 21st century that way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that essay up. I wanted to ask you towards the end, but I might as well ask now. For those listeners that aren't familiar, Jeff has a wonderful podcast called the Human Action Podcast where they discuss various books throughout the year. And that essay is part of, I believe, a book with maybe two other essays called The People's Pottage. And I was actually going to ask if you had any plans to go over that book for the Human Action Podcast.
Well, maybe I have to. Maybe that's a good idea.
Yes, I agree. Cool. Something I like about the old right is I think undeservedly there's this nationalistic label applied to them, but it's one that I think is used incorrectly because Justin Raimondo points out in his book about the old right that their nationalism wasn't in the old European nationalism mold at all, but kind of a distinctive version of nationalism that has nothing to do with that. And you actually mentioned recently in a talk that Hans Hermann Hoppe also brought this old right style of nationalism up. Can you talk about the difference between what we might call the old right nationalism versus what many people think of when they hear that term?
Well, I think most people think of nationalism in terms of belligerence, that it is expansionist, that it seeks to impose itself on countries beyond its borders, and thus it's warlike, that because it seeks autarky to have nationalistic economic policies at home rather than free trade, it has to sort of go out and plunder, and that it is generally oppressive towards its own citizens. And a lot of this, I think, comes from the history of the 20th century. There absolutely were bellicose and belligerent forms of nationalism in Europe, certainly in Germany, certainly in Spain, for example, certainly in the former Yugoslavia. So there are real-world examples. But if you go back to the 19th century and earlier, things take a little different tone. And if you actually read Mises's book, Nation, State, and Economy, which was written before liberalism, so they're both written in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, but liberalism seems to be much more widely read and discussed and quoted. Whereas Nation, State, and Economy, I find to be just absolutely fantastic book for understanding the state and its role in society. It's a pretty slim volume. You can read it in just a couple sittings. But Mises talks about the concept of a liberal nationalism, which is not at odds with, what he calls the nationality principle, which is to say you avoid the problems of autarky by having free trade with other countries. And we see that today, even a tiny country like Japan with virtually no natural resources, I should say, no oil, no farmland, no mining, etc., can be very, very wealthy through trade. So this is a form of nationalism where Japan is a nation state, but it's not belligerent to serve its needs. Now, as for internal political divisions and strife, Mises makes the case for something that is actually quite unpopular within libertarian circles, and that's secession. He says, look, we have to understand that linguistic or ethnic or political minorities have a right to self-determination, and that may not always be smooth and easy, but the way to achieve this is to allow them to break away. And so there are actually a score of quotes throughout Human Action, other places in Mises' writing, where he says, hold on a minute, about universalism. He says, well, by what universal entity, meaning God or whatever, do we decide, what is the universally best arrangement? He says we can't do that. There's multiple beliefs in deities. There's multiple beliefs in how we go about creating society. So he actually warned against universalism, which I think is one of the things which is misunderstood or underappreciated about him. And so I think the old right's conception of nationalism was different. I think that there is a difference between nation and state, and I think one can be organic while the latter is generally imposed. And, Hoppe made this point a couple of years ago at an event in Turkey. He said, if you look at nationalist movements in the 20th century, they were mostly centralizing. In other words, several countries in Europe went from their modern geography, their modern boundaries, which were honed in World War I and after World War II. Prior to the 20th century, they actually consisted of different principalities and regions and city-states and all kinds of things. So what we think of as the modern Germany was, Saxony and Bavaria and the South and all these different areas, and Prussia. And so now that's Germany. So he says, if we look at the 20th century, nationalism was centralizing, and that's generally bad. He says, if you look at the 21st century, some of the nationalist impulses which are happening out there are decentralist in approach. For instance, Brexit. Brexit is a movement which is viewed as nationalistic and jingoistic, and little Englanders is the slur against the Brexiteers. But nonetheless, they want to break away from the EU. If we look at the Catalonian independence movement in Spain. And this is not some little rinky-dink corner of the country. I mean, we're talking about Barcelona, one of the great world capitals, potentially becoming independent. If you look at some of the secessionist talk in the United States, which was occurring on the left, by the way, after Trump won in 2016, it would be occurring again today had Trump won in 2020. These are decentralists, and I tend to think decentralism is a good thing and centralization is a bad thing.
Yes, same. And do you see any way out of kind of this situation in America without decentralization?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by out. I think progressives imagine they're winning, and why should they let anyone walk away? Yeah. Why shouldn't they just dominate everyone everywhere? And of course, they all have this sort of savior complex where, there's these blue state voters and people even in these benighted red states, so we can't just sort of let them go and have their own way. But I think the problem with that is, again, there's a lot more deplorables than thought, and they're lasting a lot longer than they thought. Trump apparently actually got more votes this time than last time. So what you can offer today to the left is an olive branch to say you can have everything you want right here, right now, if you're willing to have that in certain states and certainly in certain regions and cities. But the price you have to pay for that is that you can't impose it everywhere in the country. And that strikes me as a peaceable bargain. It strikes me as a way to create social cohesion. And it strikes me as a way to avoid in other words, it's a form of soft secession rather than trying to figure out how to deal with Washington, D.C. and entitlements and the military and federal land and all these really thorny problems, which we should admit are thorny. It's a bargain, but I don't think the left will take it.
Let's talk about the official coffee of the Counterflow podcast, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. These guys are loyal supporters of this show, and I'm thankful because their coffee is in my coffee mug every morning. Once I changed the name of this show, that of course I'm bringing them over with me. They are hardcore libertarians, great supporters, and their coffee is so damn good. It's imported directly from Italy. They've got a great shop over at lorenzotti.coffee, LORENZOTTI.coffee. And on there, you can find all kinds of stuff, including this great-looking coffee bean grinder that I need one of those. They've got nice-looking tins that you can get the coffee and store it in if you'd like. They've got giant bags, medium bags, bundled packages so you can order several at a time, all vacuum sealed, of course. And since they support me here, you guys get a discount when you use promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K. That is promo code BUCK, and you will get 10% off of your order. If you want delicious coffee and you like this show, Go to lorenzotti.coffee and use promo code BUCK to get 10% off of your order. You'll be supporting the Counterflow podcast and the great liberty-minded company of Lorenzotti Coffee. One of the movements, I guess we could call it, that the Mises Institute was involved in the 90s is something that I love reading about and have a passion for, and that was the Paleo-libertarian Alliance. And I think most of my audience should be familiar with that, but I get a lot of new listeners by the week. So I want to talk with you about that. Can you kind of tell maybe a newcomer to this what that moment was about, what it meant, and talk about some of the names involved with it?
Well, there was I think a sense in the Clinton years that there could be a new brand of fusionism between libertarians and conservatives, but amongst different groups than in the past. The old version of fusionism, which was spearheaded or often attributed to a gentleman named Frank Meyer at National Review, was that, hey, libertarianism and conservatism share this sort of same commonality at their core, this respect for the individual and property rights and other things, so we ought to come together. And of course, that didn't work because conservatism, in the Buckleyite sense, went off the rails in terms of foreign policy. So this new attempt to create some sort of fusion, what we might call paleo-conservatism or paleo-libertarianism in the 90s, involved people like the late Sam Francis and Pat Buchanan and other conservatives who were not so much in the National Review orbit, and libertarians like Lew Rockwell and Hans Hermann Hoppe, who were definitely not in the National Review orbit, to come together and say, well, let's have a little bit of a truce here, and libertarians need to learn that culture matters, and conservatives need to learn that economics matters. And that would be the olive branch, or that would be the trade-off. And it really didn't quite work. There's actually a remarkable essay you can read by Hoppe. I can send the link to this, which details all the problems with what he calls the National Socialism right of Pat Buchanan and others who still supported all of these programs like public education, for example, which would ultimately, of course, be used to hang them. And of course, that's true. It was true in the 90s, but it's certainly more true today than ever. And Social Security and Medicare programs, which Pat Buchanan favored, again, Hoppe said, you're not going to have cultural conservatism when you have entitlement programs, because it's just going to allow families to not care about grandma, and it's going to tax people away from having real savings and real wealth, and we're going to have to depreciate the dollar to do it, and all these kinds of things that we still feel that conservatives don't quite get. And so it never really quite worked out, but there was an attempt there. I like the idea of understanding the cultural environment in which liberty can prosper. And what that means is that we need institutions between the individual and the state. We can't just have those two. We need, from families on up, intermediary institutions, because if we say we want less or no external governance, that implies, and I think means, we need more internal governance. In other words, we need people to be self-regulating and to be independent and to be non-criminal and to be productive and all kinds of things. So, it's always been this kind of idea of neo versus paleo, and my temperament and disposition is to come down on the side of paleo. But I don't think conservatism today has any intellectual coherence, and it's not something that there are plenty of good conservatives. I'm not sure there's any good conservatism.
Do you think there is a climate for possibly a resurgence of something like this again?
Well, I guess it remains to be seen. I mean, whether the left just takes full flight and that people begin to say, hey, look, we got to put aside these differences just because we want, some vestiges of property and capitalism to be maintained in this country. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of people think Biden is going to be heavily pushed by his left flank to punish Trumpers and really, really move the wokeism agenda ahead, full steam, no delay, none of this, milquetoast stuff. And there's some people who say, no, Biden is kind of a fossil, and he's really a product of an earlier time in Washington, and he's not a real dyed-in-the-wool, true blue believing leftist. That may be true. So it remains to be seen. But I do know that there's certainly more appetite on the right than on the left for a non-interventionist foreign policy today. If you go to a Trump rally, and say, we ought to get the hell out of the Middle East, you will get resounding cheers. If you go to a Biden rally, they wouldn't even say that. So that's one, I think, important difference today.
I spoke with you a few weeks ago, and you mentioned something to me that it's stuck with me, and I want to ask you about that as well. And you said, maybe it's time to admit we were wrong about corporations. Can you talk about that?
Well, the idea that because all corporations are to an extent in bed with the government, we use government roads, government postal service, government regulated banks, that they're still private as long as they're owned either privately or on a publicly traded market. In other words, they're not state owned and they're not state run. So corporations are, libertarians have generally thought that corporations are a good thing, and I do believe that even in the market, and I disagree with left libertarians here, I do believe that even in a true free market, there would be demand for some kind of legal entity which was acknowledged in common law, which shielded the owners and operators from personal liability so that they could build a company. I do think that would arise naturally in the marketplace, because otherwise everyone would, every time something happened, no one would ever build businesses because their house could be taken or their personal bank account could be taken. So I don't think the idea of limited liability is purely a creation of the state, which would never exist in market conditions. There probably wouldn't be as big a corporations. There might not be nuclear power. I hate to say it because I'm pro-nuclear, but I mean, just despite how safe nuclear really is and how clean it really is, the potential liability for a mistake might be so vast that it would be uninsurable, and hence no one could take it on. So, these are what ifs. So I do think that the idea of capitalism has become so muddied, and especially with regard to tech companies and what's a free market company and what isn't, that we have to be willing to admit that corporations are far from the benevolent market actors we often think they are if we're reading Rothbard in the 60s, for example.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something earlier, and I'm glad because I wanted to ask you about this. You guys covered James Burnham's book on managerialism on the Human Action podcast, and I've been thinking since I heard that it seems so often we have this debate between pure capitalism and pure socialism, and we've got to arm up here because socialism's coming to our way. And I don't know that there is a lot of people in either major party that like pure socialism or pure capitalism, but I think there are a lot of them that continue to fuel the managerial state. And I'm starting to think that's the issue to fight on right now. I don't see an AOC, I'm not even sure she believes it herself, as socializing the entire country and the government taking control of the means of production. But the managerial state continues to grow and grow. Do you see that as a more important fight right now?
Well, it certainly describes the world better than I ever understood it prior to reading Burnham. Definitely opened my eyes to this kind of third way thinking because, again, as you mentioned, we tend to think that there's twin poles. There's the political means and the economic means. And everything in between, all this third way stuff, is just kind of semi-socialism or whatever. So managerialism puts a different gloss on it and helps us to understand the growth of the state without necessarily having to ascribe deep ideological motivations to any of it. And so, yes, maybe AOC would nationalize healthcare. Maybe she'd nationalize education. Maybe she'd nationalize banking. I don't know. But from the perspective of the managerial class, especially those in government, it's far better to have, competent people running private companies for their own profit, people like Zuckerberg at eBay, than to try to have, outright socialism and have the government run social media, right? I mean, why not have smart people do it motivated by greed or money and then just reap the benefits through controlling it? That's really what managerialism is all about. So I would say managerialism is proto-fascism. It hasn't quite reached the full melding of private business and private capital with government, but it's trending in that direction. And so, who needs AOC when Facebook and Twitter themselves will deplatform people? It's brilliant if you think about it.
Yes, I know. And that's always the frustrating part is the people I consider enemies always have these brilliant tactics. And we're left over here going, shit, now what? And part of that's another thing I wanted to ask you about. You've been discussing a theme lately of post-persuasion America, and it does seem that that's unfortunately kind of where we are at. And this question's twofold. One, for those who aren't familiar with that term, can you talk about that then? And also, how should we change our messaging accordingly, knowing that that is where we're at?
Well, in a sense, I think we are beginning to understand how ideology is dead. And I never considered political liberty as an ideology per se. I think what we, I guess today, call libertarianism is the absence of an ideology. In other words, political liberty is just what happens when you leave people alone and they go out and do things with their own devices. I mean, I don't view liberty in ideological terms. Now, of course, most people would. They'd say, oh, you libertarians, you ANCAPs, you guys are so ideological. You have these tremendous blinders on. You can't get out of your own way. You have no pragmatism. So I get that argument, but I'm just telling you the way I see it. And so when we say post-persuasion America, that came to me watching Steve Bannon, one of the architects of Trump's 2016 campaign, who was on a PBS Frontline series back in the early part of 2020. It was called, I think, America Divided or America's Great Divide. You can find these YouTubes on PBS. And he said, look, even though we all have these cell phones in our pockets that have the sum total of human history and knowledge on them, if you want to look, it's not making people more open-minded with respect to their political perspectives. If anything, they're just digging in deeper. And I thought that was, I wasn't sure I agreed, but I thought it was profound in a sense that, too much information actually makes us dumber in a sense. It's not wisdom. It's just a blizzard of white noise, and you have to sift through it. And if you're going to be sifting, you might as well just light upon those platforms or voices which already accord with your own view of the world, right? I mean, that's always the easiest and happiest thing to do is just read some article that this guy's right. Those other people are terrible, Yeah. And so post-persuasion America to me is an America where we've dropped the pretense that there's some big ideological chasm and that we're debating things and that hopefully democracy creates some sort of compromise down the middle between these well thought out positions. And no, I mean, none of that is even slightly happening. The intellectual tenor in this country is an absolute farce. Academia in this country, which is supposed to be the leader of intellectualism, is an absolute farce and just populated by complete partisan hacks who just make up crazy articles and studies to, reverse engineered from their existing conclusions. It's just crazy. So intellectualism in America is very dead. And I think that's sad, but it's where we are. And so this idea that, the way that you win people over now is by persuading them in the political arena, I think is just not borne out by the evidence.
What's up, guys? I would like to tell you about a wonderful small company that reached out to me to sponsor this show because they love the content. That company is Paloma Verde CBD and Organics. It is owned by two great people, Carlos and Vanessa Abalar, in my old town of San Antonio. They are libertarians, and honestly, the COVID lockdown was a bit of a blow to their brick and mortar location. But Carlos has assured me they are tough and will soldier on with business from people like my listeners. That is you guys. They will power on. I trust that for sure. Go check out their website at palomaverdestore.com, where you can find things like their amazing melatonin CBD gummies if you'd like to sleep a little bit better. You can find the sports cream if you've got achy muscles. I know you guys work out constantly, and they've even got CBD skin salve. Of course, they have the CBD extract tinctures for daily use. They have gummies for all occasions, including strictly vegan ones, if that is your thing. You guys know the great anti-inflammatory benefits of CBD. And by the way, all of their products over at Paloma Verde are THC-free. They've even got the studies on their website to show exactly that. And so check this out. I told you they're great people. They want to support my show. Here's what they're going to do for you guys. When you use promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, you will get 25% off of any purchase over $75. You will also get 10% off of your first purchase when you sign up for their emails. So add that up. 25% plus 10% will give you a total of 35% off of your first purchase. You want to support a small libertarian-owned business and support my show at the same time and get a great product that you will love? Go to palomaverdestore.com and use promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K. That is palomaverdestore.com, promo code BUCK. This is something I've been kind of mulling over in my mind as well, because I get tempted at some points to I just want to dive into whatever Mises is putting out and kind of ignore the rest of the world. And then, I've got this format, this platform here that I have to do weekly. And so I'm always reading different stuff and kind of looking at different angles on where we are. Because again, I'm trying to adjust as we move along. But I don't know, there's a lot of my listeners that write me now and say, what should we do? How do we fix things? What's the best way? Do we go with the LP? Do we, kind of follow secessionist movements? Do we go to the MAGA crowd and reach out to them? They want to fight basically this Leviathan, because left unchecked, it feels like it's going to swallow us all up. And Rothbard had his strategy for the right. Hoppe has spoken on the topic as well. Is there what we could call a Jeff Deist take on what must be done?
No, I guess not. I mean, I'm certainly a big believer in what Frank Buckley calls soft secession. Frank Buckley is a law professor up at George Mason who wrote a book about a year ago on, the prospects for American secessionary movements. And he's not a wild-eyed radical at all. He's a conservative guy and wrote a very sober analysis of it. It's not something he personally wants to see. It is something I want to see. I mean, I want to see states increasingly competing with each other. I mean, we have a de facto form of secession going on even as we speak in terms of people moving. And this better than anybody in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
You're getting flooded with refugees. And so this is a profound shift away from cities and away from blue states, away from the cold, snowy, dark Northeast to places like Arizona and Idaho and Texas and Florida. And so that fascinates me as an experiment. And again, we don't need to do away necessarily with the federal government or with its trappings and its money and its military and its federal lands if we can move more and more towards having things decided at the state and local level on everything else. I mean, I would like to see us more like Switzerland, where if we have to pay taxes, something like 80% of our taxes go to state and local governments and only 20% to the feds. It's generally the opposite here in the U.S. today. So I would like to see that change. And I would just like to see a real movement of sovereignty among the states to say, look, we're going to have radically different approach to COVID. We're going to have a radically different approach with respect to gun laws, with respect to abortion laws, with respect to property taxes, with respect to homeschool laws. I would like to see states go out and obtain, using their, exchange U.S. dollars for either precious metals and or Bitcoin, and start holding that as a reserve and create repositories where if there was a currency crisis with the dollar, which is certainly not far-fetched, certainly not, unbelievable, that they could immediately have a currency on offer in their state so that business could be conducted and have that backed by something. In other words, become their own central banks. I would like to see all kinds of things happening at the state level, which are experimental. We've seen some favorable crypto laws and banking laws passed in the state of Wyoming under the leadership of Caitlin Long out there with a company called Avante. We've seen repositories in Utah and Texas. We've seen some novel homeschooling approaches being taken up with COVID, and especially because for the first time, a lot of folks on the left no longer see homeschooling as weird or for religious right types. They say, well, maybe I want my kid home now too after we've had him home anyway, and we're worried about COVID, or we just, it turns out our local school wasn't that great. And so there's a lot of great opportunities out there, and people are really moving. And so there's I think a lot to be optimistic about from the perspective of a Rothbardian or Hoppian strategy. And I think these kinds of movements are far more exciting and I think far more fulfilling ultimately than, again, this idea that we have to persuade 51% of the American electorate to agree with us and, vote for Rand Paul or something. I mean, I would much rather see people turning their backs on Washington, D.C. rather than trying to capture it.
Mm-hmm. I want to, you're leaving us on a white pill, so that's helpful. And your podcast, I mentioned it earlier, is wonderful because kind of like you mentioned, there's white noise everywhere. And to be able to just kind of dive into a book, a classic, and then hear a discussion on it is it's at this point, it's wonderful because it's such a break from the monotony of where everything's going and where everything's been. Can you talk about the Human Action Podcast, exactly what y'all do over there? And I also want to ask, what books might you be going over in 2021? And do you have any must-reads to my listeners?
Wow. Yes to all of those, I guess. I did a podcast for several years, and I certainly had the benefit of the Mises Institute's name to help me get traffic, but I was doing sort of general topics relating to the government and economics. And I just wasn't that satisfying because it just seems like the last thing the world needs is more sort of libertarian commentary on the news of the day or something like that. And so we switched to a books format where we would read a book every week and then discuss the book in the podcast, except when the book's really big, like Human Action or Man, Economy, and State, then would take several weeks. And so we knew that this would limit the audience somewhat because, not everybody wants to do that, and people want to listen to more newsy or topical things. But we also knew we want to reach people maybe narrower but deeper. And so let's go after that self-selecting audience because there's not really any books podcasts out there. If they are, they're just, New York Times bestsellers or that sort of thing. They're certainly not in econ. So we said, let's do a books podcast. And so we've done a lot of great books over the past few years, some Mises and Rothbard and many, many others. And I think I can certainly tell you some of the books that will be on the docket this year. At some point, we're going to go through Keynes's General Theory from the 1930s, which is an important book to read and understand simply because we tend to very breezily say something's Keynesian without fully understanding it because a lot of Keynesians, he wouldn't agree with them, a lot of modern Keynesians. So that's an important book. We're going to read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which will be several shows, another thick book, to really give people who want to read Austrian stuff at least a decent sense of what the neoclassical school was and how its modern, from whence its modern counterpart arose. We're definitely going to go through some of the meatier Hoppe stuff, like his theory of socialism and capitalism, for example. And we're definitely going to go through here and there. Between the heavier, longer books, we'll do some one-offs on the shorter, funner stuff. And occasionally I even like to throw in a book that just came out. We reviewed Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth a month or two back. We reviewed a great book by a really interesting tech guy named Jeff Booth called The Price of Tomorrow, a guy who's coming to what we might call an Austrian understanding of deflation as a benevolent force in society, but he's coming at that non-ideologically, just a tech guy. So there's plenty of books to be read. And, if you don't want to read the book or take the time, listening to the show is sort of a Cliff Notes for these various books. So we hope people will follow me at Jeff Deist on Twitter and check out the Human Action Podcast, which generally comes out every Friday.
All right. And also anything you guys have coming up with the Institute, you can feel free to plug away for that as well.
Well, we're going to do a ton of live events this year, just like we did last year. We kept going during COVID. We had live events. Nobody got sick. We had great crowds. People were enthusiastic, thrilled to get out. So we're going to keep that up. We'll probably be focusing on topics of strategy and secession. We'll probably be talking a lot about money because I think what's happening in fiscal and monetary policy is just absolutely crazy, and we need to be talking about that. We'll be talking about the effects of these COVID lockdowns, which are going to be staggering. And we're talking about a decade. People don't really understand that yet, I think. So that's important. And we got some great book projects coming up. We're going to unveil a 900-page Hoppe series of lectures from the 2000s, which are really broad and sweeping. We're going to issue a new book from Patrick Newman, who edited Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, Volume 5 in the Progressive Era. He's got his own new book coming out on the history of crony capitalism in the United States, which is going to be a great read. I've got the galley proof right now. And we're going to have a great, short, under 100-page, little tiny, like $5 paperback. We'll probably give it away free at events. An Austrian economics primer. I think that's the correct pronunciation in the English world, but some people say primer. Yes. By Per Byland, the professor at Oklahoma State. So that's going to be a fantastic little, if you wanted to get all the, everything you think you know about Austrian economics distilled down into just a brief little pamphlet, then we're going to have it.
Excellent. Well, it's good that we got out of this on a white pill and an optimistic note. So thank you so much, Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute, for being with me once again.
Thank you for having me.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that great chat with the Mr. Jeff Deist. I'm always stoked to talk to him. He's one of my favorites to just listen to. And like we said during the podcast, you have to check out the Human Action podcast. And we talked about a few books there in that interview. I will link to all of them in the show notes page. We've got, for one, we talked about the Hans Hermann Hoppe essay on the Paleo-libertarian alliance, so where things might have gone wrong. I will link to that. Let's see, I wrote notes. We talked about the revolution that was. It's in a book with two other essays called The People's Pottage by Garrett Garrett. I will link to that as well. I highly recommend reading all of those, the material by those guys from the old right. It's excellent. So I can't recommend that stuff enough. Let me see. F.H. Buckley, Jeff mentioned him in the interview. He wrote a book on secession. And if you guys remember, I actually had him on maybe a year, it might have been longer than that, a year ago or so, when back on the Death to Tyrants podcast. So I will link to that episode and his book in the show notes page. And of course, we mentioned the Mises book, Nation, State, and Economy. I will link to that. See, you guys get all this excellent homework just from one episode here of Counterflow. So, like we mentioned in the previous two episodes, we are transitioning the website to Counterflow. As of now, it's still the Death to Tyrants podcast website, death2tyrantspodcast.com. You can find me on Twitter at BuckRebel. Let me tell you about this other thing really quick, this group. Are you familiar with the Telegram app? Because if you are, well, we're on there too, and we've got a little chat group going. Basically, get the Telegram app and search Counterflow with Buck Johnson, and you should find us. It's public. And all are allowed until you're physically removed. How about that, so to speak? So, until next week, you guys have a great week. Talk to you soon.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.